I opened my eyes after 3 years, and the first thing I saw was Lisa wearing someone else's ring. Not mine. The diamond was smaller, thinner, newer, and it wasn't the one I gave her. My throat was dry, my chest heavy, but my mind raced ahead of my pulse. Had I died? Had I been erased? Had everything I built been handed to the man standing behind her, Robert? He stood with one hand in his pocket and the other resting gently on Lisa's back, like he belonged there, like I had never existed. Lisa's voice was a whisper, barely touching the edges of guilt. "Jacob, you're awake." I wanted to scream, but all I could manage was a shallow breath and a broken sound that didn't resemble words. She took a step closer. Robert didn't move. I looked down at my arms, IV lines, tubes, hospital gown. I'd been out of the world for years and they hadn't even removed my wedding ring, because to them, I was still hers, but to her, I was a memory. "You weren't supposed to come back," Lisa finally said, as if I had violated the end of a story she already concluded. She reached out to hold my hand. I shifted it away. Robert cleared his throat. "Jacob, it's good to see you conscious. You didn't think I'd wake up," I rasped. "So you married my wife." Lisa looked away. I searched her face. I searched for something, anything, that would show hesitation, regret, but all I saw was resolve, and a stranger's ring on her finger. Lisa tried to explain. "I waited for a year, then another. The doctor said you were gone, brain dead. We mourned you." "Did you bury me, Lisa?" She looked stunned. "What? You mourned me, so did you bury me too?" She stepped back, lips trembling. "That's not fair. You don't know what it was like." "Fair?" I said. "Is that what this is now? You and Robert, fair?" Robert interjected. "Jacob, there's a lot you don't understand." "No," I said flatly. "There's a lot you hoped I'd never know." The silence in the room grew thick. I closed my eyes, but the pain didn't leave. When I opened them again, they were still standing there, together, wearing guilt like perfume, meant to smell like sympathy, but stinking of betrayal. The nurse came in with a clipboard, startled by the tension. Lisa placed her hand on Robert's arm. "Let's give him space." As she turned, her gaze met mine, and in that 1 second, I saw something flicker. Not love, not relief, fear, not me, but of what I'd become. Because I wasn't the Jacob she left behind in the hospital bed, that Jacob had died. This one had just begun to wake up. They left the room. I stared at the ceiling. 3 years ago, I had a wife, a best friend, a company. Now I had nothing, except time, and Teresa. I pressed the call button. The nurse returned. "Get me my phone," I said, "and call Teresa, now." The nurse blinked. "Who should I say is calling?" I didn't even hesitate. "Tell her Jacob's awake, and it's time to remind the world who really built everything Robert stole." Because I had come back from the edge of death, and I wasn't leaving quietly. Jacob Harris was the kind of man who believed in permanence. He believed that once you gave someone your loyalty, it stayed. That once you said "I do," it meant forever. That once you built something with your hands, it should stand long after your bones gave up. That's how he loved. That's how he lived. At least, before the accident. Before the crash that took 3 years of his life and gave everything he had to someone else. Before the ring on Lisa's finger no longer matched the one still sitting cold and forgotten on his own hand. Before Robert, his best friend since childhood, the man who once stood beside him as best man, became the new name tied to everything Jacob had once called his. Before the world rewrote history in Jacob's absence and decided he was better as a memory than a man. But Jacob didn't just wake up from a coma, he returned. And behind the glassy fog of medication and hospital lighting, behind the hollowed cheeks and weakened limbs, behind the slow-moving muscles and trembling speech, Jacob's mind was alert. Alert enough to remember every detail of the last moment he lived. It had been raining that night, heavy, the kind that blurred windshields and silenced reason. Lisa had called him, crying. She said she didn't feel safe. That Robert was acting strange. Jacob, halfway across the city at a shareholders' dinner, didn't hesitate. He excused himself from the table, grabbed his keys, and ran to her like he always did. Fast, blind, reckless. The crash was instantaneous. Metal crushed, glass shattered, bones snapped. He had thought of her the second the world turned black. And now he was back, only to find the woman he crashed for had chosen someone else during the silence. Lisa. She was everything Jacob had built his life around. Elegant, sharp, ruthless in her ambition, but soft in the arms of the man she claimed to love. They met during a corporate gala. Jacob had just closed his second funding round for a tech platform that no one believed in except him and one intern who brought him coffee with the wrong spelling on the cup every morning, Teresa. Lisa was the rising PR director of a firm representing his main competitor. She approached him like a storm. "Jacob Harris," she'd said, her smile dazzling and unapologetic. "Everyone keeps saying you're a fluke." He grinned, sipped his wine, and replied, "Then I'll make sure to stay unpredictable." They were inseparable after that. She was the one who believed in making bold moves. He was the one who did the math behind them. She polished his edges. He grounded her fire. They married in under a year. It was fast, but it felt inevitable. Robert, Jacob's oldest friend, his brother in all but blood, had warned him once. "You're too trusting, Jake," he'd said while fixing Jacob's tie before the ceremony. "One day, that heart of yours is going to get ripped in half." Jacob laughed it off. Better half a heart than none at all. He hadn't known, of course, hadn't seen it, that the man holding his tux pocket square with one hand would one day hold Lisa's waist with the other. That the man who toasted to forever that night would be wearing Jacob's cufflinks while taking his place. That Robert wasn't just warning him, he was planning his spot. Jacob had been the golden boy. Built a company from scratch, bought a home that looked like a magazine spread, took his assistant, Teresa, from her tiny desk by the elevators to an executive role in less than a year because he valued loyalty over credentials. He never forgot who helped him build. Teresa was one of them. She was the quiet storm. Sharp-eyed, subtle, often underestimated, she never fought for the spotlight. She stayed 2 steps behind Jacob at all times, her tablet always ready, her expression unreadable. She never asked for raises, never bragged, never flirted, but when Jacob's car crashed that night, it was Teresa who sat at the hospital for 16 hours straight while Lisa was unreachable. It was Teresa who argued with the doctors about second opinions, who updated his board, who managed internal crises while the vultures circled. And it was Teresa who kept coming, week after week, to sit by his bedside, even after Lisa banned hospital visitors without prior consent. When Jacob opened his eyes and demanded her number, it wasn't sentiment, it was strategy. He remembered who stayed. He remembered who left. He remembered everything. But Lisa, she wasn't the same woman who once slept beside him, whispering dreams of beach houses and babies. She wore her guilt like perfume, expensive, thick, trying too hard to cover something sour. Lisa told herself a story for 3 years. One where she was the grieving widow who deserved to move on, where Robert was just a shoulder to cry on, where tragedy justified betrayal. Jacob let her live that story, at least for the first 10 minutes of their reunion. After that, he began writing his own version. Because the truth wasn't just betrayal, it was theft. Robert had sold Jacob's stake in the company during his coma, claiming medical power of attorney granted to Lisa. They'd liquidated his accounts, sold his condo, moved into a villa that Jacob had once scouted for retirement. And worst of all, they rewrote him. Articles showed Lisa and Robert at charity galas, smiling for cameras as though they were the phoenix rising from Jacob's ashes. No one talked about the man in the coma, just the tragedy, the love story, the convenient silence. But Teresa remembered. She kept files, digital backups, audio notes, even security footage from the office that showed Robert forging signatures. And now, Jacob had more than enough proof to burn everything down. Still, he didn't want revenge for its own sake. He wanted clarity. He wanted his name back. His company, his life. And maybe, just maybe, he wanted Lisa to see what it meant to be truly abandoned. To see how it felt when someone you loved walked past you like you were a stranger in a suit. Jacob didn't want her back. He wanted her to remember what she gave up the moment she took off his ring and slipped on Robert's. Because Jacob Harris wasn't just coming back. He was rebuilding from rubble. And this time, he wasn't asking for loyalty. He was demanding it. 3 days after Jacob's awakening, Lisa stopped answering the hospital's calls. Doctors insisted she return for a conversation, for paperwork, for closure. She didn't. Robert sent a single message to the hospital director. Please update us through our attorney. They had already turned the page. But Jacob hadn't even started the new chapter yet. He sat by the window of his recovery suite, staring at the skyline he once owned. The city hadn't changed, just the players. And now, he wasn't the king anymore, he was the ghost in the walls. When Teresa arrived later that evening, Jacob didn't ask for pleasantries. He simply said, "Tell me everything they did." Teresa didn't hesitate. They moved into the Dawn Villa 3 months after your coma. Lisa gave power of attorney to Robert citing prolonged cognitive absence. He signed over your voting rights in the board, transferred 42% of your personal shares into Matthew's capital, and pushed a merger that gave Robert CEO privileges under the clause of corporate survivability. Jacob didn't flinch, he only nodded. And the marriage? They legally filed for death declaration 18 months after your accident, Teresa continued, her voice clipped. You were listed as presumed deceased based on medical scans. Lisa held a private ceremony. She never changed your last name, though. She kept it for the brand, Jacob said bitterly. Teresa didn't confirm. She didn't need to. Instead, she pulled a folder from her bag. These are your private holdings. The ones Robert couldn't access because you kept them under your father's inheritance clause. Jacob flipped through them. Land titles, hidden stocks, silent partnerships, a trust in Singapore he'd forgotten he even opened. He smiled for the first time in 3 days. Good, he said, then we start with this. But Jacob, Teresa hesitated. If you go public now, they'll paint you as the bitter ex. Lisa's got a huge PR machine behind her. They'll say you're vengeful, that you're traumatized, that you're unstable. Jacob looked up, his voice steady. Then let's give them something real to fear. Robert didn't expect to find Jacob standing in the boardroom. Not on a Tuesday, not during quarterly strategy, not with that look in his eyes. Jacob, he muttered, half rising from his chair, eyes darting toward the executives seated around the table. You should be resting. I did, Jacob replied. 3 years' worth. A cold hush spread across the room. He dropped a thick brown envelope on the table. It slid forward, landing in front of Robert with a soft thud. Original shareholder contracts, board voting documentation, and a medical report proving full cognitive function signed yesterday morning. Robert's jaw locked. This is a hostile ambush, he hissed under his breath. It's a return, Jacob corrected. Lisa wasn't there, but her fingerprints were all over the mess. That evening, she showed up, in person, no security, no makeup, just Lisa in a long beige coat, standing at the edge of his hospital bed, looking smaller than he remembered. You really filed a board motion against Robert? Jacob didn't reply. He watched her expression shift from disbelief to anger. Jacob, this isn't the man I married. He laughed once. Exactly, that man died 3 years ago. I waited for you, she said defensively. I grieved, I suffered, and you show up, dig through old paperwork, and attack the one person who helped me survive? He looked at her like a stranger. You didn't grieve, you replaced, you mourned me with a mansion and a marriage. Her voice sharpened. What did you expect? You were gone. They told me you'd never breathe on your own again. And yet here I am. That doesn't erase what I went through. Jacob rose slowly, supporting himself against the bed rail. What you went through, he said softly. Lisa, I crashed on my way to save you. I destroyed my body because you said you didn't feel safe. And when I woke up, you belonged to the man I trusted most. You call that survival? She turned away. And that was answer enough. Lisa and Robert weren't evil. That's what made it worse. They hadn't plotted Jacob's downfall with twisted villainy. They hadn't lit candles over his empty bed. They hadn't danced on his grave. They had simply moved on, quietly, conveniently, selfishly. The world forgot Jacob because it was easier. But not Teresa, never Teresa. He remembered one night, 2 years into his coma, when Teresa had broken hospital policy and snuck in during off hours. A nurse caught her curled up by the window, talking to him. She brings him books, the nurse whispered once, reads to him, sometimes laughs at her own jokes, she said, even if he doesn't hear her, at least he won't feel alone. Jacob never forgot that, and he never forgave Lisa for silencing it. Conflict, though, wasn't only emotional, it was tactical. Robert began a counter-offensive within days. He released a press statement. JH Group expresses concern over Jacob Harris's health status. We're grateful for his recovery, but he needs rest, not revenge. He followed with a donation in Jacob's name to a neurotrauma charity. He smiled for cameras. He leaned into sympathy. Lisa, too, appeared on a podcast. They framed their marriage as a tragedy turned redemption. She wore a muted black dress. She spoke of pain, of letting go, of how love found her in the ruins. But behind the scenes, they panicked. Because Jacob was regaining ground, asset by asset, ally by ally. And Teresa was orchestrating the strategy. Then came the email. From a former board member. Jacob, I've kept this for a long time. It's a recording, from the night of your crash. Thought you should. Hear it now. He clicked the attachment. Robert's voice crackled through the speakers. She's alone, man, vulnerable. You don't get it. Jake gives too much. He smothers. I can give her space, real choice, maybe if something happened to him. Silence. Then Lisa's voice. Don't say that. That's not funny. I'm not joking. Jacob sat back in his chair, eyes burning, hands shaking. So it hadn't been accidental. Maybe the rain helped, maybe the brakes didn't fail on their own. Maybe the call Lisa made wasn't just a plea, maybe it was a setup. He didn't show the recording to Teresa, not yet. He needed clarity. He needed truth. So he called Lisa. Meet me, he said. No cameras, no mics, just you and me. She hesitated, but agreed. They met at the rooftop of a hotel Jacob once took her to on their anniversary. The skyline shimmered. He stood beside the railing, the wind catching his coat like a ghost come to life. Lisa approached slowly. Why here? She asked. Because this is where I realized I loved you, Jacob said. I thought maybe it'd be poetic to end it here too. Lisa's face twisted. End it? Not my life, he clarified. The last of my delusions. She stepped closer. What do you want from me? He pulled out his phone, pressed play. Robert's voice filled the silence. Lisa's eyes widened, her knees gave. She dropped to the ground. You think I planned it? She whispered. I think you let it happen, he replied. And that was worse. Jacob didn't sleep much after that rooftop meeting. He couldn't. Even after Lisa had left the roof in tears, even after he'd watched her disappear into the elevator alone, his body had refused to settle. His brain, once slow to wake from coma-induced silence, now pulsed with images, memories, and sounds on a relentless loop. But it wasn't the accident that haunted him. It was the voice. Robert's voice. Cold, calculated, cruel, his oldest friend. He replayed the audio every night, as if to keep the pain raw on purpose. Maybe he needed to remember exactly who he was dealing with. Maybe he needed to stop thinking that what happened to him was just unfortunate timing. No, it wasn't timing, it was choice, it was betrayal. And it burned deeper every hour. There were moments, quiet, broken ones, when Jacob found himself gripping the side of his bed at night, fingernails digging into the padding as his body trembled with a fury he couldn't release. He had lost years, weddings had happened, companies had shifted, friends had walked away. He had missed funerals, birthdays, contracts, market crashes and rebounds. The world had spun forward and not once looked over its shoulder. And now here he was, awake but forgotten, breathing but behind. He looked in the mirror sometimes and didn't recognize the man staring back. The reflection had Jacob's eyes, but not his posture, not his stride, not his confidence, just a shadow in hospital gray, tracing the edges of a name once respected. And it terrified him. Not the silence, not the betrayal, but the possibility that maybe, just maybe, he would never get back to who he was. That somewhere along the way, in the months of sleep and tubes and sterile air, something in him died completely, something irreplaceable. He tried to focus on revenge, on justice, on rebuilding. But underneath it all lived fear. Fear that when all this was over, there'd be nothing left to return to. Lisa was gone, Even if she begged, she would never belong in his future again. The ring she now wore had erased every vow she once whispered in his ear. Jacob no longer remembered the softness in her voice, only the coldness of her silence. And Robert? The man who shared his childhood, his college dorm, his late-night business pitches, that man didn't exist anymore. He had been replaced by a smiling thief in Jacob's clothes. It hurt more than he admitted. Because if Robert could turn, what about everyone else? Had they all just been waiting for the right moment to forget him? He wandered through his thoughts like a man walking through a burned-down house. Sometimes he found fragments, the day he first bought the company's original office chairs. The night Lisa fell asleep beside him at her parents' cottage, whispering dreams of starting a charity. The afternoon Teresa brought him a cold coffee and he still drank it because she looked apologetic. Tiny moments, unimportant to others. But now, they were all he had. Jacob couldn't even tell if he was angry or just tired. When Teresa came to visit, she sometimes found him staring at the wall, unmoving. "You okay?" she'd ask softly. He always nodded. But he wasn't. Not even close. There was guilt too. Guilt for missing everything, guilt for leaving his company unprotected, guilt for not seeing through Robert sooner. Guilt that Lisa might have been unhappy and he never knew. Was it possible he'd failed her too? Had he been too obsessed with building, with legacy? Had he made her feel like an ornament instead of a partner? He wanted to say no. But a whisper inside him said yes. It drove him mad. The questions clawed at him in the dark. What if I stayed that night and never took the call? What if I'd told Robert to back off years ago? What if I'd paid closer attention? But the truth was, no matter how much he rewound the past, the outcome didn't change. He was here, alone, awake, and haunted. The suspense wasn't in what had happened, it was in what might still come. Would Lisa fight to clear her name? Would Robert try to take him down again? Would the world believe him or side with the narrative they'd been fed for years? He had no answers. Every day was like walking through fog, unsure if a blade or a handshake would come next. And then there was Teresa. She remained constant, patient, sharp, loyal. But even her presence came with its own emotional weight. Because Teresa looked at him like he was still the man she once worked for. She didn't pity him, she didn't tiptoe, she simply offered what she always had, unshakable faith. And that terrified Jacob. Because what if he let her down too? What if he couldn't recover fully? What if he lost the battle? He didn't know how to carry the expectations of another person again, especially not someone who never stopped believing in him. He began distancing himself from her emotionally, even if she didn't notice. Less eye contact, fewer personal questions, shorter conversations. He didn't want her to get close enough to hurt him. Not again. But one evening, while watching security footage from the old office, Teresa placed her hand gently on his wrist. "You're allowed to grieve," she said. "You lost time, Jacob. You lost trust. That doesn't make you weak." He didn't respond, but her words echoed in his head all night. Maybe grief was what he had mistaken for rage. Maybe he hadn't accepted any of it yet. Maybe part of him still thought he would wake up again and realize this was all a nightmare layered on top of another. But every morning, the truth stared him in the face. Lisa moved on. Robert betrayed him. Teresa stayed. And Jacob? Jacob was somewhere in between memory and resurrection, standing in a life that no longer fit, trying to stitch together a future with hands still trembling from the past. And the suspense, God, the suspense, wasn't in revenge. It was in not knowing who he would become by the end of it. Would he emerge as the man they all thought had died, or someone entirely different? Would rebuilding himself cost what little remained of his soul? He didn't know. He only knew one thing with absolute certainty. He would not let them win. 3 weeks after Jacob returned to the boardroom, something strange happened. Robert disappeared. Not physically, but from the press, from interviews, from quarterly meetings. Even his social media, which once overflowed with curated perfection, suddenly went dark. No yacht posts, no tech forecasts, no Lisa, just silence. At first, Jacob assumed it was a strategy. Robert had always been good at retreating before striking. He'd vanish behind a wall of silence, then come back with some twisted masterstroke designed to regain favor, power, or both. But then Teresa came in holding a brown envelope she wasn't supposed to have. It was slid under her office door with no return name, no message, just a stamped company seal Jacob instantly recognized. It belonged to Lothridge Keene, the law firm Robert had used to finalize his claim on Jacob's assets during the coma. Jacob opened it slowly. Inside were two things: a printed page marked Confidential Memo, Internal Correspondence, and a photograph. The memo detailed a wire transfer. One dated 6 weeks before Jacob's accident. The amount? $80,000. The recipient? A freelance private investigator specializing in vehicle tampering and remote-triggered mechanical failures. The signature? Robert Matthews. Jacob stared at the memo without breathing. But it was the photograph that broke him. A grainy image, clearly from a parking garage security feed, showed Robert talking to a man in a gray hoodie next to Jacob's old car. The timestamp was 1:36 a.m. 2 days before Jacob's brakes failed. Teresa stood across the desk. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. Jacob's hand trembled as he laid the photograph down. It wasn't a setup anymore. It was attempted murder. That night, Jacob drove out to the Dawn Villa. He didn't call ahead, he didn't bring security. He needed to see her. Lisa opened the door in a robe. Her eyes widened when she saw him. Jacob. He stepped inside, pushing past her without a word. "What is this?" she demanded, following him. He held up the photo, then the memo. She paled. Her hands fell to her sides. "I didn't know," she whispered. Jacob turned to her, eyes cold. "Don't lie to me." "I swear, Jacob, I never saw that man. I never knew Robert paid anyone. I thought it was just a horrible crash, I swear." He wanted to believe her. But her voice cracked the same way it had when she once said, "I waited for you." And now he knew how hollow that statement really was. "Then you better start telling the truth," Jacob said, "or the next time I show up, it'll be with an indictment in my hand." She collapsed into a chair. "He said the car malfunctioned," she said faintly. "I never looked into it. I didn't want to know." "No," Jacob said, voice low. "You didn't want to lose your convenient narrative. You didn't want the fairy tale with Robert to get blood on its pages." Lisa buried her face in her hands. Jacob left without saying goodbye. The next morning, Teresa found him at the waterfront, sitting in his car. He looked different. Tired in a way sleep couldn't fix. She climbed into the passenger seat and waited. Finally, he spoke. "He tried to kill me." She nodded. "I always suspected it was more than business greed," she said. "Robert doesn't believe in slow wins, he believes in wiping the board." Jacob exhaled. "I was naive," he murmured. "I thought loyalty mattered. I thought being generous made people stay. I built everything around trust, and that made me easy to destroy." "No," Teresa said softly. "That made you worth saving." He turned to her, and for the first time, his eyes softened. "Do you ever think maybe I wasn't supposed to wake up?" Teresa looked straight at him. "You did. That means the story isn't over. It just changed genres." He smiled, briefly. Then said, "We go public." That week, Jacob held a press conference. Not about the company, not about stocks, not about recovery, about truth. "I was not in an accident," he said calmly, facing a room full of reporters. "I was targeted." He laid out the evidence without theatrics, the documents, the wire transfer, the photo. No names were mentioned, not yet, but the world could connect the dots. It took less than 24 hours for Robert's face to flood every screen, every headline, every trending page. Lisa's name followed. And then came the court summons. Robert was subpoenaed. Lisa was named as a witness. Social media turned hostile, investors dropped deals, sponsors cancelled contracts, partners vanished overnight. Within 3 days, Robert's assets were frozen under suspicion of fraud and attempted homicide. Jacob didn't gloat. He watched everything unfold with the same quiet expression he'd worn when he woke up in that hospital bed. He hadn't just taken back power. He'd exposed rot, but it came at a price. Because Lisa called him T.I. Woe days later, her voice frantic. "They're coming for me too," she whispered. "The media, the prosecutors, they think I helped him." Jacob was silent. "You have to believe me," she said. He replied only once. "You didn't help him pull the trigger, but you handed him the gun." She didn't call again, but the storm wasn't over. Teresa came into his office a week later, pale. "There's another problem," she said. Jacob looked up. "Robert's filed a statement," she said. "He's blaming Lisa, said the wire transfer was part of a plan she orchestrated, that she hated you, that she talked about needing an out. He submitted text messages." Jacob's jaw tightened. "Are they real?" Teresa hesitated. "Some are edited, but others might be real, I don't know." He leaned back in his chair. Of course Robert would drag Lisa down with him. Whether she was guilty or not, it didn't matter, not to him, because when you drown, you grab whoever's close, even if they once wore your ring. The news media devoured it. Lisa Matthews, widow or co-conspirator. Robert claims wife of coma victim orchestrated attack. Love, lies, and attempted murder, the JH Group scandal. Jacob became a name again, but not for his vision, not for his work, for the scandal. It gutted him. This wasn't how he wanted to return to the world, not as a headline, not as a survivor. He wanted to be remembered for the company he built, not the betrayal that tore it apart. He stared at his reflection one night, still wearing the same watch he wore the day of the crash. He remembered Lisa giving it to him. "I want you to never lose time," she had said. Now it ticked slower, heavier. Time had been stolen, but not anymore. He picked up the phone. "Teresa," he said, "let's end this." The courtroom was quiet. Too quiet for a scandal that had consumed the country for weeks. Jacob sat in the front row, not at the witness stand. He had already given his testimony 2 days earlier, but today, he was just a spectator. On paper. In presence, he was the storm they all pretended not to fear. Teresa sat beside him, her posture rigid, fingers folded tightly in her lap. She hadn't said much that morning, neither had he. They both knew what today was. It wasn't the day Robert went down, that had already begun. Today was the day Lisa would take the stand. Jacob hadn't seen her in person since the night he dropped the audio and photo evidence in her lap. That version of Lisa had still carried the echo of the woman he once loved, but what emerged into the courtroom today was someone entirely different. Her hair was tied up tight, no makeup, a gray blazer, pale lips. She looked like a shell, but she stood tall. The bailiff swore her in. The prosecutor stepped forward, and the air shifted. "Mrs. Matthews," the prosecutor began, "did you have knowledge of the wire transfer made from Mr. Matthews to a private investigator 6 weeks prior to Mr. Harris's car crash?" Lisa's lips parted, her voice came out thin but steady. "No." The prosecutor nodded. "Were you involved in any discussions about Mr. Harris's assets before the crash?" Lisa paused. Jacob leaned forward without realizing it. "Yes," she said. "But nothing criminal. At the time, Robert and I were discussing succession in case Jacob never recovered. It was speculation." The next question was sharper. "Were you romantically involved with Robert Matthews prior to Mr. Harris's accident?" Lisa didn't blink. "No." "Did you consider yourself still married to Mr. Harris at the time of his crash?" Lisa looked toward Jacob. For one brief moment, their eyes met. She said softly, "Yes, I did." Gasps echoed lightly behind them. The prosecutor glanced at his notes, then said, "Mrs. Matthews, are you aware of the implications of perjury?" "I am." "You understand that your former husband is seated in this courtroom?" "I do." The prosecutor took a slow breath. "Then I'll ask you one final time. Did you play any role, either directly or indirectly, in the incident that left Jacob Harris in a coma for 3 years?" Lisa closed her eyes. When she opened them, she wasn't looking at the jury, or the lawyer, or the judge. She was looking straight at Jacob. And she said, "Yes." A chill ran through the room. The judge banged his gavel once. "Order." Lisa kept speaking. "I didn't hire anyone, I didn't sign anything. But I knew something was wrong that night. I knew Robert was upset. I knew he hated how much Jacob gave me. I knew there was tension building. I called Jacob that night because I wanted him to come, because I needed him, but also because part of me wanted him to see what I had become, what I was choosing. Her voice cracked. I knew Robert had said things, dark things, but I thought it was just anger. I ignored them. I told myself he was venting. I convinced myself Jacob was too strong to be broken, that he would always come back, and when he didn't, I let the silence cover my guilt. She stepped away from the microphone slightly. I didn't try to kill Jacob, but I didn't protect him either. The judge raised an eyebrow. Mrs. Matthews, is this an admission of conspiracy? No, Your Honor, Lisa said quietly. It's an admission of cowardice. Outside the courtroom, reporters swarmed. Teresa shielded Jacob with her coat as they pushed through flashing cameras and questions that had no answers. Back in the car, they sat in silence. Until Teresa finally said, "You know what this means?" Jacob nodded. The case is no longer just corporate fraud. She just implicated herself. And she freed me. Teresa turned to him. What do you mean? Jacob stared out the window. She told the world what I never could, that she chose him, that she let it happen, that I was never crazy. He leaned his head back against the seat. I've been trying to prove to everyone that I was betrayed, but that confession, it wasn't for them. It was for you, Teresa finished. Yes. The trial stretched on for weeks. More witnesses, more files, more evidence. But Jacob didn't return after that day. He didn't need to. The narrative had shifted permanently. Robert's lawyer tried to spin Lisa's words as emotionally charged self-blame, but it was too late. The damage was done. Between the wire transfers, the doctored contracts, the questionable transfer of ownership, and now Lisa's quiet devastation, the house Robert built was collapsing brick by brick. And Jacob? Jacob disappeared from headlines. By choice. He didn't need a camera in his face anymore. He had something better. Peace. Not the complete kind, not yet. But the first crack in the wall of grief had begun to let light in. He returned to his office quietly. Walked the halls. Some old employees cried when they saw him, others avoided eye contact out of shame. He greeted everyone the same, warm, polite, but distant. He wasn't the same man, he knew that, and that was okay, because the world that had erased him was now writing his name again, not as a victim, but as a survivor. One afternoon, while sorting old files, he found a handwritten note, not addressed to anyone, no signature. It was in Lisa's handwriting. If you wake up, I hope you hate me, because if you don't, it means you still love me, and that would be crueler than any punishment I deserve. He folded the paper slowly and placed it into his desk drawer without a word. He didn't hate her, not anymore. Because hate requires too much energy. And Jacob was tired of bleeding for people who wouldn't even whisper his name when he was unconscious. Teresa stood at the balcony of his penthouse a week later, holding 2 glasses of wine. He joined her, hands in his pockets. The city glowed beneath them. Do you ever wish it had gone differently? She asked quietly. Jacob considered that. Sometimes, he said. But then I remember something. What? He looked at her. I wouldn't be standing here if it had. She smiled, a small, private thing, and handed him the glass. To second chances, she said. He raised him. To finally be awake. 3 months after the trial, Robert was sentenced. 8 years in federal prison for fraud, embezzlement, and attempted corporate sabotage. The charges related to the accident didn't stick, the planted evidence was too clean, the connections too circumstantial, but that didn't matter anymore. The real sentence was his fall from power. His empire collapsed publicly, his name became synonymous with betrayal. His former investors blacklisted him. His tech firm was seized and liquidated. And when he was escorted out of the courtroom in cuffs, his head low, cameras flashed, not in reverence, but as proof of his failure. Jacob didn't attend the final verdict. He watched it from his office, calmly sipping tea while Teresa adjusted the blinds behind him. Want the volume up? She asked. He shook his head. I already know the ending. But in truth, this wasn't an ending. It was a prologue to the life he had reclaimed. He had been forced into silence for 3 years. Now, he didn't need to shout. The world was already listening. Lisa left the city shortly after the trial. There were no formal charges filed against her. Her public confession, while damning in sentiment, wasn't criminal enough to warrant prosecution. But socially? She was untouchable. Her face was taken off every brand campaign she endorsed. Her consulting firm collapsed overnight. The industry she once ruled with glass heels and staged smiles turned cold. No gala invites, no public apologies, just articles dissecting her downfall. Jacob never contacted her again. But one morning, he received a letter postmarked from a small coastal town. No return address. Inside was a single line. I finally took off the ring. He folded it once and placed it into the fire. Some things needed to burn. Jacob rebuilt JH Group brick by brick. He brought back old staff, promoted those who had remained loyal, sold off the dead way. Teresa, once his assistant, was now the COO. "Never thought I'd sit in this chair," she said one evening, running her fingers over the smooth wood of the executive desk. Jacob stood at the window, watching the city breathe. "I always knew you'd end up here," he replied. She turned to him. "You could have made anyone your second, why me?" He turned slowly. "Because when I was just a name on a hospital chart, you still saw me as a man, and you never stopped believing I'd come back." Teresa smiled. "I didn't believe it, I knew." The world was watching him again, but this time, they watched with admiration, not pity. He was invited to speak at conferences, praised for his resilience, awarded for his return from the dead. Magazines labeled him, the man who rebuilt himself. But Jacob knew the truth. He didn't rebuild. He rose. And every step he took forward was a step away from the man who once chased love with blind devotion. He no longer believed in fairy tales. He believed in action and justice. One evening, at a private charity event hosted by JH Group, a young entrepreneur approached Jacob nervously. "Mr. Harris," he stammered, "I've read everything about you, your story, it's incredible." Jacob smiled faintly. "It's just a story." "No sir, it's a lesson." The young man extended a small card. "My startup is struggling, I'm losing investors, everyone's telling me to sell, but your comeback gave me hope, if you could fight your way back." He trailed off. Jacob took the card. I looked it over. "You're in the wrong business," he said simply. "You're not building software, you're building trust, never forget that." The entrepreneur nodded rapidly, as if the sentence was scripture. Teresa watched the exchange from across the room. She knew what was happening. Jacob was becoming more than just a businessman, he was becoming a myth. But even myths have wounds. Late one night, Jacob returned to the old house, the one he had bought for Lisa when they married. It was still empty. He had refused to sell it, refused to demolish it. Instead, he turned it into something else. A foundation. The Harris Trust, created to support victims of corporate abuse, whistleblowers, silenced employees, and betrayed partners. Funded entirely by Jacob's recovered assets. Teresa had tried to talk him into naming it something symbolic, Phoenix Fund, or Second Breath. But he insisted on using his own name. He wanted people to remember who had been erased and who had returned. Inside the foyer of the house turned headquarters, the original wedding photo still hung on the far wall, Lisa in white, Jacob in charcoal, smiling, hopeful, doomed. One day, Teresa found him standing in front of it. "You want me to take it down?" she asked. He shook his head. "No, leave it." She raised an eyebrow. "Why?" He looked at the image for a long time. "Because that man in the photo. He deserved to be remembered too." Jacob didn't date for a long time, not out of grief, out of protection. He had been broken once, thoroughly, quietly, from the inside out. And though he no longer bled from it, the scars taught him not to love quickly. But Teresa? She never asked for his heart. She stood beside him, listened, fought, waited. And one day, without meaning to, he found himself watching her across a table, realizing he hadn't thought of Lisa in months. The realization hit him gently, not like a storm, more like rain tapping a rooftop you forgot had a leak. He reached across the table, touched her hand, and whispered, "I'm ready now." She didn't smile. She didn't blush. She only nodded, fingers curling around him. And they both understood. A year after Robert's conviction, Jacob received a call. From the prison. He hesitated, then answered. Robert's voice was raspier than he remembered. "Congratulations," he said. "You won." Jacob didn't speak. Robert laughed bitterly. "I'll admit, I didn't think you had it in you." Jacob's reply was calm, measured, final. "You were right about one thing, Robert. I used to believe loyalty was stronger than ambition, but I learned the truth from you." "Oh?" "Loyalty isn't about who stands with you when you're at the top. It's about who waits for you when the world thinks you're dead." Robert went quiet. Jacob continued. "You had the chance to wait. You chose to take it." He ended the call without waiting for a reply. Some victories didn't need to be heard, only felt. Years passed. The story faded from tabloids, replaced by fresher scandals. But Jacob's name never faded from the industry. He wasn't just a man anymore. He was a reminder that trust, once shattered, could be rebuilt into something stronger. That betrayal didn't define the victim, it exposed the betrayer. That silence wasn't a weakness, it had potential. One rainy evening, Jacob stood on the rooftop of the same hotel where he first confronted Lisa after waking up. He closed his eyes. The air smelled the same, the wind felt the same, but he was different. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the ring. Not the one Lisa wore. The original. His wedding band. He had never taken it off. Until now. He placed it on the railing. Watched the wind carry it over the edge. And just like that, the past was released. Not erased, just no longer in control. Back at home, Teresa was waiting. The fireplace crackled, the room smelled like cinnamon and old books. She didn't ask where he'd been. He walked up, took her hand, and kissed it gently. Then whispered in her ear, "Thank you for saving me." She smiled. "You saved yourself," she said. He pulled her close. "No," he murmured. "You reminded me I was still worth saving." They stood like that for a long time. Not saying anything, just breathing, together. And this time, Jacob wasn't dreaming. This time, he was truly awake.